The EU reign of terror, what is it? And how are they carrying it out? That is the question of today's video. This is John Rowell from the Rowell Report. And if you like this video at any point, please hit the like button, share, and subscribe. Well, the EU found the perfect recipe to silence critics and to control free speech, and that is by the EU sanctions list. These are these idealistic phrases which are not laws, and breaking them are not crimes, but basically for the EU, which is now throwing its the kitchen sink at trying to maintain Ukraine afloat, both politically and economically, and you could add in there militarily, but the EU really doesn't have much. The EU countries doesn't really have much to give to Ukraine, just things here and there, but basically they're supporting them politically and economically. That are the big support areas of the EU. And so they don't like anyone opposing what they're doing. So basically, they come up with these highly pretentious points of how you can wind up on a EU sanctions list. So you have support military aggression. That's number one. Finance, supply, assist, or materially support wars of aggression or territorial annexation. That's important because we will be seeing that shortly with an activist who was sanctioned. Enable human rights abuses. Are we trying to fight human rights abuses, or are we trying to support them? Because the EU seems to do the opposite of what it says it does. Anyway, 3, fund sanctioned regimes or proxies, or I imagine receive funds from sanctioned regimes. So anyway, this is also important. So anyway, evade or help others evade sanctions. So let's say someone's on a sanctions list and you send them money because they're not able to buy food, they're not able to pay rent. So if you send them money, you're supporting whatever they're doing, and then you get sanctioned. So supply dual use or prohibited goods, that's 5. 6, undermine democratic processes. You mean like the election that took place in Moldova, which was appears on many fronts to be a sham election, which was praised by the EU as being fully compliant with democratic processes. Also, the election that took place in Romania, the main contender from the opposition to win that election was carrying out a normal campaign, and the opposition decided to create a social media campaign on his behalf. I'm sure he wasn't too appreciative, especially because then somehow they traced all of this social media campaign to Russian bots. So then the EU came in and said, hey, you're getting help from the Russian bots. You're getting help from Russia. You're a Russian agent. So they basically took him out of the race, even though he had not set up this social media campaign and was not receiving any assistance from Russia, and there was no evidence to that. In fact, there evidence to the contrary. So then he was eliminated from that election process, and so someone else took his place from the same party, and he was leading the polls 2 or 3 days before the elections. And then in a kind of a landslide, the EU candidate won. So, what's going on there? So anyway, we talk about democratic processes, but really, the EU carries out its kind of color revolutions different on EU soil, and so there's really no interest in democratic processes in the European Union, um, as long as the candidate is fully compliant with all EU rules and is willing to bow down deeply. So we have number 7, profit from occupied or illegally seized territories. I mean, this is a topic for another discussion, but you have to go back to the whole history of the conflict in Ukraine to figure out that the people who lived in these territories declared independence because Ukraine wasn't respecting their basic human rights. So they declared their independence. They raised an army to fight against all the shelling and attacks on their cities because their families were in danger. And Russia tried to help Ukraine mend fences with these dissident groups, territories, and found that nothing they did worked, and they tried for 8 years. So eventually they had to step in and to help push out the Ukrainian troops from these territories. So you say illegally seized territories. Then you go to the UN Charter about self-determination of peoples, and you realize, you know what? Territorial integrity is not absolute. It's not a sacred cow, but it's treated as if it's a sacred cow exactly when it's beneficial to the EU. But like if you take the case of Serbia and Kosovo, the EU doesn't care about territorial integrity. So they go on and on about territorial integrity when they don't even respect that. And I thought, what is going on? Why all these sanctions on people who raise a voice against what the EU is doing? And then I thought, well, let's take a closer look at these cases. We have Natalie Yam, who is a activist, and so I decided to do a little investigation on why she was sanctioned. So first, people are saying that she is in cahoots with Wagner in Africa, and receiving funds or somehow involved financially with the Wagner organization that's in Africa. And what is Wagner doing? Wagner's was pushing France out of Africa. Why? Because France is imperialistic power and has been basically acting as with imperial control over African countries. So Natalie was living in the Ivory Coast, and she was an activist to try to get France and French imperial activity out of Africa. And so she gave a speech in Russia, in Sochi, and so then Macron from France didn't like what she said about French activity in Africa, and so the French government got into contact with the Ivory Coast, and they arrested her. She basically left Ivory Coast without her money, basically with summer clothes, and she took refuge in Switzerland in the winter, basically in the wintertime, with just some, I guess, sandals and some winter clothes. Summer clothes. So anyway, she winds up in Switzerland, and she continues her activist work. And so then, Macron decides he wants to put her on this sanction list because she's living in Switzerland. So we have this journal from the European Union about Natalie Yam. Natalie Yam is a social media influencer. So she's basically a person who's online. This is where the beef is going to come from. Since the Sochi summit she attended in 2019, Natalie Yam has been an outspoken supporter of Russia, adopting Moscow's language and targeting France and the West in particular. So basically, because she was trying to get France out of Africa. She is somehow collaborating with Russia. She's a Russian spy or a Russian agent, with a view to ousting them from the African continent. She has specific ties with Afrique, basically Wagner. So they don't prove that, and there's no effort to prove it. There's no link to any documents that to show that. Therefore, Natalie Yam is supporting actions or policies attributable to the government of the Russian Federation. So she's a Russian agent because she's trying to get France out of Africa. Yeah, like try to figure out the logic of that. And she is threatening democracy, the rule of law, stability and or security in the Union or its member states. So because she's working to oust France from Africa, she's a danger to the EU and she's a danger to France. Again, a head scratcher. Isn't Africa on a different continent than France? So how is she working to affect the country France? If the country France has economic interest in different parts of the world, it needs to work. It needs to compete for that like everyone else. It's not a given. So pretty strange. And then she's threatening democracy. So basically what France does is that it controls the governments and manages elections. It always keeps the people in charge who it wants to be in charge. So that is what France does. It was doing that in Haiti, and look what happened to Haiti. A mess. And they want to continue to repeat that over and over again in Africa. I mean, they also tried to do that in Mexico with Maximilian and Carlota, and that didn't go very well for them. But back then, there wasn't any way to sanction any of the Mexican leaders. I'm sure they would do that today if they could. But anyway, if you take a look at what happened during the French Revolution, what the EU is doing is very similar. They had this thing called the Committee of Public Safety. You know, that is a very pretentious name, very similar to the Truth Committees of the EU, and they carried out punitive measures without criminal law violations. So you didn't have to violate any law. There was minimal or non-existent due process. Due process, you need to be charged with the crime. You need to give the opportunity to defend yourself, to be able to find legal assistance to defend yourself, to be aware of the accusation, to see the evidence against you. So non-existent due process, opaque decision making. So the EU makes these sanction decisions behind closed doors, and there's no sense of who voted in favor, against, what was the reasoning used, what was the evidence that was used, and severe life-restricting consequences. The sanctions on EU citizens, especially those living in the EU, is life-restricting. You can't leave the country if you're in the country. You can't enter the country if you're outside the country. You can't access any of your credit cards. They will demonetize you from the various social media. You basically you have no way of earning an income, of paying your expenses, of supporting your family, and you can't leave to find somewhere else to do that. So anyway, there are 5 similarities between the French Revolution and the modern EU-style sanctioning, punishment without a defined criminal law violation. What criminal law did Natalie Yam violate? No prior notification or formal charges. She was never notified that she was charged, never given the opportunity to know what she was being charged with, to present evidence on her behalf. Opaque decision making by unaccountable authorities. These EU committees that go behind closed doors and make decisions, that's very opaque, I would think. Trials as formalities are eliminated entirely. There's no, for the EU sanction, there is no trial. It's just an administrative measure. You added to a sanctions list, and then after that, your life is turned upside down. Life-crippling consequences short of execution. In the French Revolution, they seized assets, social isolation, surveillance, inability to work or function publicly. That is exactly the EU sanctions regime. This is like pulled from Robespierre and the Reign of Terror. Then we have an American who was the first U.S. citizen to be added to a sanction list, and basically this individual is someone who was working in the he was working in policing and in law enforcement, and he was aware of an immense amount of corruption going on in U.S. law enforcement. And he had people he knew who wanted to come forward and to speak their mind and talk about the corruption that was going on, but he needed a way to protect their identities because the whistleblowers would be punished. So he created all these websites where people could go to leave the information they knew about of corruption in U.S. law enforcement, and so they started publishing that information, and the FBI didn't like it, so they started surveilling him, and eventually they raided his home. They took away his computers, and basically he was under threat, so he left the country. And this is his words, but anyway, this is what he's saying. And then he went to Russia and began forming all these websites where he was maintaining his, he was he was providing an income for himself, but at the same time, he was continuing what he was doing was providing an outlet, kind of WikiLeaks. So you could call him WikiLeaks for law enforcement. And then he got added to the sanctions regime. So I'm going to play just a brief seconds of this interview. I'll leave everything below if you like. And he talks about why he thinks that they're adding individuals to the sanctions list. So anyway, here's a few seconds from this interview.
The article, and I laughed with my friends. I think they wanted to try to set an example out of me, saying that, hey, if you speak your views, then you could be sanctioned too. Not me, but to the general people. If you have a pro-Russian voice and you disseminate information that is honest, even though it benefits Russia, then we can put sanctions against you like we did John Mark Dougan. I wrote a book about various aspects of the special military operation and why that Russia was left with no choice but to.
So basically, he was putting out information which he thought was honest, which was supportive of the Russian special military operation, and he was sanctioned. So he's not breaking any law. This is a basic human right to have free speech. So he's speaking his mind, and he's put on a sanction list because somehow he's breaking some unwritten law that's discussed behind closed doors, and his punishment is never he's never given an opportunity to provide his point of view, his side of the story. You just get put on a sanctions list, and so all this is this speaks so much to the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror. It's just really amazing. So basically, they're saying to you and me, you can't express your opinion unless it agrees with ours. And this is what the 1984 book was about. The book burning. Anything that disagreed with what the regime held as sacred cows, you're not allowed to express that. You're not allowed to keep it, you know, in the public view. And if you do, you'll be punished. So anyway, I think all this EU sanctions is a reign of terror for all those people who want to speak their mind. Of course, if you just, you know, lower your head and bow deeply to the EU and to everything that they ascribe to, and when they do a regime change in our control elections in EU countries, you of course have to say that democracy was in full view of everyone. When they deny the basic tenets of the UN Charter on the self-determination of people, you have to say, no, they can't do that. Territorial integrity is the only principle which we have to ascribe to. Of course, when it comes to Serbia and Kosovo, oh, that doesn't apply. That doesn't apply. I'm sorry. So you have to not only learn to bow down deeply to them, but you have to learn all the exceptions to the rules which they set for everyone else. So I think this is very dangerous, and anyone can be sanctioned, and then U.S. companies will also punish you. I think in some cases, those that want to do business in Europe, they're just also going to bow their heads and just carry on, So anyway, this is quite unfortunate, but this is what's going on, and this EU reign of terror will continue. They will continue to expand the list until they shut down all discussion, all dialogue, all exchange of opinions. Everything which is held sacred in democracies will disappear, and then we will just have EU law, the creator of all truth and wisdom, and we will need to bow deeply to that. So I think that is what's coming in the future, unless people continue to speak their minds, and of course those people will go on an EU sanctions list. So that's very unfortunate, but that's what's going on, and I thought that would be important for everyone to know about. So if you have any comments to make, please do so below, and I'd love to hear from you, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos. Take care. Bye-bye.